Hey guys, welcome back to Molcons. Well, we are not together in one place, but we are together here. So it's great to be here, guys. We've got a great show for you today. With Dennis Brennan. He is an author and historian. We're going to find out all about his thoughts about Trump and free speech and comparisons of history of politics. So
Indeed.
yeah, it's going to be exciting.
Today, we are joined by historian and author Dennis Brennan, who we are delighted to have with us today. So, Dennis, you reached out and you said you enjoyed the podcast and our take on modern politics, which was incredibly sweet and kind. And you actually have a new book out called DC Swamp Strikes Back, Aaron Burr, Donald Trump, and Their Similar Battles, which sounds incredibly interesting and which we'll be talking to you a bit about today.
Thank you for joining us, Dennis.
Well, thank you both. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to discussing the book and anything else you want to discuss.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we did mention your book, DC Swamp Strikes Back, Aaron Burr, Donald Trump, and Their Similar Battles. You uniquely seem to be drawing similarities between Trump and notorious US Vice President Aaron Burr. Could you tell us a bit more about the book and what inspired it?
Yes, it was inspired by two things. One, a friend of mine who, here in the States, the Democrats and the Republicans are very split. And he is a Democrat political consultant, but he's a friend still of mine. I lean more towards the Republican side since I think I've been voting that way since 1980. But he wrote a book about Aaron Burr, and he asked me to read it. I read it, and a lot of it had to do with Aaron Burr's fight with Thomas Jefferson. And he came back to my office, I don't know, about 2 weeks later. I guess he thought I could read quickly, but I had gotten through it. It was a good book. And he said, well, what do you think? And I said, well written, great book, but, and when anybody says but, you have to wait. So I said, I think you missed the real story on how Burr was treated compared to how they're treating Trump. And this is, Trump had not yet been elected. Again, it was the second time. So he looked at me as Democrats often look at Republicans, like I was nuts. And he said he didn't see that at all. So I said, well, if you're not going to fix it, I'm going to write my own book. And I started researching it to see if I was correct. The more I dug into it, the more I realized there are a lot of similarities between the two. And, and that history, at least here in the United States, repeats itself and in many ways. So that's really where the book came from. And the more I started writing, the more I liked writing about this and found it interesting. And I like, going on podcasts and talking about it too.
Well, that's really cool. I'm glad you do because it's really a perspective that I've never really thought about, to be honest. But one thing that kind of really struck me, well, there were several, but let's start with this. On Donald Trump, do you so you argue he's a victim of lawfare. Do you believe that if any of the chances are against him are legitimate, that they're all politically motivated, or is it just that they perhaps have something, maybe a mustard seed, and they carry on?
Yeah, I think some of it is exactly as you say. You call it a mustard seed. Like for instance, the document case in New York, which I go in depth about, that's not a case you turn into a felony. It just isn't. And but they turned it into a felony in New York for political reasons and to drag him into the courthouse and to make him a felon so they could, have a campaign, which they still do. They still say, well, he's been convicted. He's a convicted felon. It's like, okay, at worst, it was a payment to someone that's a porn star who, he's alleged to have had sex with, and he was covering it up. Okay, he paid taxes on it. Otherwise, he would have been indicted for that. So what he put in his own documents in the business, it's not really a crime. At worst case, it's a misdemeanor. So yes, very exaggerated, I think.
I think you're probably right. And then lots of people, just stay on Trump a little bit more, sort of argue that his rhetoric fuels division. So he kind of almost thrives on it, which is quite combative. Do you think that it's going to worsen his persecution? Do you think that if he runs again, he's going to end up in the same situation, repeating Burr's fate? What do you think will happen in the next? Predict the future for me, will you?
Yeah, I think, he's talked about a third term, but it's really not allowed by the Constitution. I think
Yeah.
he's doing that just to get under the skin of his opponents.
Yeah, it works.
I think, yeah, it works. And I think in some ways that's the combative nature of his personality, that there's some great video of him, prior to becoming president or even running for president, where he kind of lays out his personality, that he believes if someone comes after you, fight them, and you don't let anybody beat you up with words. You come back and hit them harder. And it's funny because that's what he's done. I mean, even after winning the presidency, it's not often that he'll take a verbal hit, or, even with the lawsuits, he's gone back and sued, television networks, newspapers. He is a fighter. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
So I think the talk about running again isn't going to happen. But I think he's, if his health is there, I think he's going to be a force in the Republican Party that he's kind of remade in his own image in large part. So he's going to be around.
Yeah. Interesting.
So Dennis, in your book, obviously you draw lots of comparisons between Aaron Burr and Donald Trump, and you reveal a lot of interesting facts. Like, one of the early facts that you reveal is that Aaron Burr's father founded Princeton University, which was incredibly interesting. And considering, nowadays, at the moment, at this time, Trump is seemingly at war with the Ivy League universities, removing millions of dollars of funding. What do you make of this, and what do you think Aaron Burr would make of this?
It's hard to say what Aaron Burr would make of it, because so much time has gone by, and are those universities living up to what they were chartered to do? I think Trump and a lot of Trump supporters would say they aren't, that they've become, basically just indoctrination places and not education. I think it is interesting that his father, Burr came from a family, that was successful. So did Trump. You start a university, you have some success. It's not as if these are Abe Lincoln type men who, were born in log cabins and so forth. It's hard to say born into wealth, but I'd say more so than most of us. And it is interesting now that, Burr's family was deeply into education. Trump's, I don't think they've ever been associated with any of the universities. And now Trump is obviously battling with some of the universities over DEI and other issues that, don't fit into what his view of the world, or at least the country, is.
Yeah, so on that, you said, both Trump and Burr attended elite institutions. So both were beneficiaries of a great education. Do you think it's, you've said that the reason is that universities are now kind of indoctrinating lots of young people. And I think a lot of young conservatives, especially across this side of the pond, feel that when they go to schools or university, they don't feel like there's that right wing kind of representation. So I do think that's fair. But do you think that institutions have always had a left-wing bias? I remember when I was at school, they were always quite led by the left wing. Is that something new? Is it new, what Trump's trying to fight, or is he just trying to, level the playing field?
I think it comes down to leveling the playing field, because yes, when I was at school, they were left wing. The professors were, for sure. I don't know if the administration was. I didn't really care, but I think the professors were, and how we dealt with that, and maybe how you dealt with it, was you gave the professor what they wanted to hear, and then when you left the room, you talked about the professor and how crazy they were. And that they would, it's amazing. The only job they could get is to be a professor, because they're totally wrong. And we didn't, so I don't know if they might have been trying to indoctrinate us. It wasn't really working. but I think over the course of time, at least here in the United States, that has started at the universities, and now we went back through the high schools and even the grammar schools, the elementary schools, where some of these thoughts are being taught to the students. And when I was in K through 8, it was mathematics, English, spelling was big. You had to be able to spell. We stuck to the basics. There was science class. We didn't really get into, personal issues. I have no idea about any of my teachers, like what they thought, what their political opinions were. And they didn't share those opinions, at least at the elementary level. In high school, I was in an all boys Catholic school. So you had some idea where they were, religious brothers were teaching it. So you had an idea of where they stood. I mean, it was based on church teachings. But I think it's changed a bit because it has creeped into the lower levels. And now when those students get to the universities, they're already kind of used to those ideas, and they may even believe them. And I think Trump and a lot of the Republicans are fighting that, realizing if you don't, you're going to have generations of liberal voters voting against you. And that's probably a big reason Charlie Kirk started doing his tent revivals at the universities, became very popular doing that. At the beginning, when he was first doing it, he ran into a lot of opposition. He didn't have the big crowds. I think everybody now, in the wake of his death, think that all those crowds were huge. But at the beginning, he has given interviews, or had given interviews, where he said, sometimes it was all opponents that were there. And that certainly changed in the last few years, where people were cheering and it almost became a political rally.
Yeah, super interesting. Sort of on that free speech vibe, obviously, because Burr didn't have allies such as Fox News, if you will.
Yeah.
It means it is slightly a different turning point in the USA. So, do you think that that it's harder for the swamp to silence the outsiders, or they're just or are they just too vulnerable for to suppression? Do you think it's something that is going to have a real changing impact compared to how Burr was able to handle the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and we it's a little bit, in the book there's some of this, but I think it's the reality of the times, right?
Right.
In Aaron Burr's time, you had to wait a long time to find out what the news is.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to the end of slavery, which a lot of people joke about, where some of the slaves in Texas didn't know they had been freed like 2 years earlier. It's, how could you not know? Growing up in this time, it's like someone, Charlie Kirk, when he was shot,
Yeah.
I knew within minutes because it's popping up on my computer while I'm working. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think part of that is, yes, the mass communication has changed so much. You did have newspapers, the parties owned the newspapers back in Aaron Burr's time, but you didn't have, as you point out, Fox News on one side, a lot of other media outlets on the left side constantly throwing information at us. You have newspapers. Now you have podcasts out there. There's, we have Joe Rogan, who's more influential than, most commentators, whether they're on TV or elsewhere, and he's doing a podcast. There's, and of course, social media, with X and with Facebook and everything else. It's a media where people are getting what they call the news, whether it's true or not. There's something coming out.
Yeah. And on that, with Charlie Kirk's passing, obviously that's shone like such a spotlight into the whole free speech platform, that do you think that it's helping Trump's fight against the establishment narratives, or does it does it have an opposite effect? Because obviously, when you look online and you see both spectrums of the conversation, it's quite a minefield out there. So, what do you think the overall impact of Charlie Kirk's unfortunate death is going to have, and on free speech, and with relation to Trump's narrative that he's putting out there?
Yeah, I think in just a short time here, we've seen, both sides fighting over who the killer belonged to. I
Yeah,
mean, which is kind of sick.
yeah,
And it's amazing that so much time is being spent on that. I've had, friends and relatives going back and forth on, he's one of yours. It's like before anybody even knew who he was, and it becomes a problem, but it seems like that's the kind of free speech we have now, and we're trying to adjust, right?
yeah,
Because there's a lot of false free speech where people are out there. And then you have, Charlie Kirk. I was a fan of his, and I've seen many more videos since the unfortunate day when this gentleman shot him, because they've been playing them constantly everywhere. And you see the discussions, and he really was for free speech. He would let anybody come up before him and ask questions, and most of those people were negative towards him and did not
yeah,
have the same position. So I think it's a credit to him that he wanted them to speak and to be able to debate, and that is what we should have, rather than unfortunate. What we have sometimes on social media is I put something out, and I don't care if you have a better point. I'm going to keep my point, and I'm going to repeat it 100 times, because I'm not listening to you. I'm just telling you. So I
yeah,
think that's our problem going forward. I think how that, finally ends up, I don't know. It probably stays the same.
yeah,
The politics, even when Charlie Kirk was shot and killed, and my first thought when I saw it, which was, you see him grab his neck in the blood, and then I hear that his wife and his small children are there, and I think not only do they have to go through it now, but the children especially. It reminds me of President Kennedy when he was shot. His
mm,
kids were very small, young, and they would see that for 60 years, where
yeah,
your memory of your father when you're 3 or 4 years old, or in Kirk's case, the one child is 1. He's never going to remember what his dad was, except he's going to see this terrible video.
yeah,
And I felt sorry, for them. That now I know other people, were on all these social media outlets, kind of not feeling sorry for anybody. Actually, some of them saying things like it couldn't have happened to a better person, or now get the other one. I think
mm,
meaning Trump. It just sickness that, unfortunately, that's the downside when you allow free speech. You do get everybody's crazy thoughts. And some
yeah,
people, my mother used to say, have you no shame? That people just go out there and say anything. You didn't want to be shamed out there by being considered a fool.
yeah,
And I think now people don't care because they're on social media doing it. And
yeah,
that's sad. It's sad for our country,
yeah,
and probably how we look elsewhere too.
Just changing tack slightly, I'm sure we'll come back to it as well. You revealed in the book that voters kind of hark back to political heavyweights, so time in the days of Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Franklin, and that now 2/3 of American voters say they're tired of seeing the same candidates in presidential elections and want someone new. Kind of tired of seeing Biden, tired of seeing Trump, Hillary, the Clintons, all of the dynasties. And we kind of have a similar voter apathy in the UK. What do
Mhm.
you think that voters are crying out for, or who do you think voters are crying out for? What are they looking for in a candidate or a candidate of the future?
I think, here, I think the issue was, yes, we want someone new. When Trump ran, he was what people were asking for. Now, maybe they didn't know that, and maybe they didn't think it was going to be quite the way he's gone about his job. But they wanted someone outside. We want an outsider. We want someone to fight the establishment. We think, a lot of people think there's a huge conspiracy between those families. The Clintons who were trying to, put Hillary in as president, the Bushes who, had, H.W. Bush, as 41 and then come back with George W. Bush, and tried in 2016 with Jeb Bush, who, by the way, I thought was going to win the Republican primary. That's how out of it I was. I missed the whole Trump move. And, Trump destroyed not only Jeb Bush, who was the big name, but all those names on there were much more experienced politically. Trump really was what people were crying out for, first in the Republican Party, and then I think in the whole country there. And unfortunately, though, even though we ask for that as voters, and I don't know if this is similar, I assume it is, we ask for all these things, but then when you get that person, you say, well, I didn't mean that. I didn't know you were going to do that. And we start battling ourselves the other way. It's like because one of the things thrown out is, well, Trump is fighting the establishment, our FBI, our CIA, some of the people in the State Department, they've cleaned out what they consider the bad actors. And that's what we were asking for, though, as voters. Then we turn around and go, well, wait a minute, I support the FBI. There's kind of this, banging of heads, and it's really our own head that we're banging into each other. And for some, in some ways you think if you're Trump, you have to think, wait a minute, you people asked me to do this. You elected me to do this. I told you this is exactly what I'm going to do. And now you're complaining that I'm doing it. It becomes a problem. So maybe as voters, we really don't know what we want. We just think we do.
Fair. We see that a lot. And in terms of kind of what we want, so obviously social media, you talked about it being the way most people get their news now, and I think that's the same over here. You also spoke about the suppression of stories, so Facebook, Twitter, pre-Musk, and suppressing the Hunter Biden story and shutting down the accounts of the New York Post and filling the algorithms to kind of reduce the reach of the story, which they said at the time had the hallmarks of Russian interference, but then ultimately turned out to be a real story and legitimate. Right. You kind of highlight the danger of social media suppression through that story. And, we had Zuckerberg at the time, you note, kind of saying, yeah, I did slightly suppress things through the algorithm. He obviously has now switched to Trump, and we saw that when he was at the inauguration. Do you think their kind of realization that they were being manipulated by the swamp made them switch? Do you think that was the motivation? And how can we avoid, tech founders being manipulated again by the authorities? And how can we keep social media neutral, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a real good question. I think, it's funny because these gentlemen that own the social media outlets or own enough of it, I guess their stock, whether it's Elon Musk now or Zuckerberg, you look at that and you think, boy, if I had that kind of money, I would say whatever I want and do whatever I want. At least in my mind, that's what I think. Now, whether I would, I don't know. Maybe I would have been the same way. And they call you and say, well, take Donald Trump off of, what was Twitter at the time. And Jack Dorsey does it. What are you thinking? I mean, especially here when the basis of the country is this freedom of speech, the First Amendment. That's the big one that we walk around with great pride, right? Nobody's like us is what we say. Well, what were we doing? We weren't any better than anybody else. And I think, going forward, I mean, I was surprised when Musk bought Twitter. But I was shocked was Zuckerberg. I mean, in the one election, 2020, he had put a lot of money into what they called get out the vote, but it was Zucker bucks. And the money was really to support the Democrats getting their vote out. He was clearly, advocating at the same time, running what, I would consider now this new journalism, Facebook and social media. and I think we've always had that there's been owners of newspapers, Hamilton owned, started the New York Post. So there's been political people that have owned newspapers and, media outlets, but they tried to at least do that as keep it kind of down the middle as time went on, as we got into more modern times. Social media threw us back into the party press time where, hey, I'm with the Democrats, I own this, and I'm going to do what I want. And if you speak out, I'll just take you off my site and you can't say anything. It really, now Donald Trump, I think, one of the ways he fought back was starting his own, Truth Social, Rumble, which some of his allies started. There's other outlets, which is probably a good thing that there's more outlets in case, one or two decide to shut down freedom of expression. And hopefully, I hope we've learned our lesson that nobody is going to do that in the future. And we realize, as bad as some opinions are to our heirs, we have to put up with that. We're just stuck with it.
A good quote in your book actually is, the power of a compliant press and powerful politicians can be overwhelming, whether it is in the 19th or 21st century. So that was pretty accurate.
Right. And I think that's sometimes the history, we always think like, oh, that'll never happen again. And to that point, not that it's related to the book, but, up until, recently, I was one of those people, and recently, I mean, in the last couple of years, I was one of those people where you constantly heard about the Holocaust and never let it happen again. And I'm thinking, that's never happening again. No. But then, the recent events in the Middle East over the last year or so, and the reaction, at least here, but I think also all over the world, where you have this great division and real hatred, and I'm thinking it could happen again. You actually could have this happen again.
Yeah.
And it's almost, you've got to correct your own mind that, oh, it's so historically bad, it'll never happen. It could.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And kind of going back to, freedom of speech and talking a bit about post Charlie Kirk, you mentioned in the book that Trump appeared on the Jimmy Fallon show a couple of times. And you said the first time no one expected him to secure the nomination. So it was really lighthearted, and it featured the mirror skit, which later was created by SNL with Kamala Harris. And you said then Trump returned again, and even though he was actually the candidate at the time, Jimmy Fallon and him got on well. There was a lot of respect there. Obviously, we've seen that recent fallout between MAGA and Jimmy Kimmel, another late night TV show host. Do you think the biggest difference between those kind of relationships and responses to each other is the respect element? Do you think that's what was missing with Kimmel versus Fallon? Is there just like a lack of respect that, Trump's camp felt with that comment that obviously was taken way too far?
Yeah, I think, Fallon, out of, the three hosts that we had until recently, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, and Jimmy Fallon, which, Fallon was probably the least political of the three, more of a goofball type, host. The other two were very political. And, now Colbert, who had the highest ratings of the bunch, but was losing a lot of money. It amazes me that it, took, I think, 100 staffers to put on the show. It's a talk show. I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and think you don't have 100 staffers putting this together, right?
Funny that.
you quickly lose a lot of money with that. And I think that's CBS, saw that, especially the way viewership is now fragmented. We have so many choices. It's not, when I was growing up, Johnny Carson was the, only guy out there. Anybody that came out against, that tried to compete quickly lost and was off the air. But even after that, Jay Leno and David Letterman had good audiences. Then, but they weren't as fragmented. Now we've got so many choices with Netflix, HBO, or HBO Max, or whatever they call themselves now, Paramount. There's so many things you can watch, and people do. Plus, let's face it, a lot of people aren't even watching TV. They're playing on their phones and, telling everybody their opinion. So I think with Fallon and with all of these, a lot of the Hollywood types, even though Fallon show's a New York show, but I'll consider all of entertainment Hollywood here, they had a different opinion of Trump when he wasn't the candidate. He was, he was well liked among those elitists because he was at least a millionaire. I don't know if he was a billionaire then. He was flamboyant in a way of, always out there talking about the buildings he was putting up, the resorts. He was always in everybody's face and everybody's news. You saw Donald Trump. You probably didn't know other developers, but you at least knew who Donald Trump was. And he had the Playboy image, at the nightclubs, and, he went through a divorce at that time. And so he was, someone that the left seemed to like, and they would joke with him. Fallon had him on The View, had him on several times. And those interviews, when you see those videos, you're like, wow, someone changed here. Now, did they, it's their job to stay down the middle, basically. And I think Fallon tried that. Kimmel and Colbert were so far into the politics of it, as if they were political commentators. And, personally, I quit watching it because every joke can't be an anti-Donald Trump joke. And it's not even a joke at some point. It's just mean-spirited comments. And you're like, that's not cutting it. Now, if you're hitting everybody, making fun of everybody, okay. But I would still say, let's balance the political stuff with, going after Hollywood people, media people, or just the rest of us that sometimes get in the news. Some of the funnier stories are what ordinary people do. And there's enough jokes to do a short monologue every night. And I don't understand why they decided, hey, we're just going to cut off half the audience. At one point, Kimmel said if you don't like his show, don't watch it. Well, America spoke and they didn't watch it. Like, why would you tell people not to watch it? I don't understand that. With my book, I'm telling people, read it. If you like Trump, you like him even more. If you dislike him, maybe you'll learn something.
Yeah.
After that, go burn it after you bought it if you don't want to put it on your shelf. So
It's true. So Burr tied with Jefferson, and there was chaos. So in the 1800s, when there was chaos in Congress, then Clinton denied the legitimacy of the 2016 election, and then Trump denied the 2020 results. So there seems to be a trend that election denials are like part and parcel of the parcel. Isn't it an actual American tradition, or is there something far more sinister in those loaded debates?
Yeah, I never considered it a tradition, but it seems like it's become that way, right?
Yeah.
And if you go even in 2000, when George W. Bush won and it went to the Supreme Court, the hanging Chad in Florida, we used to have the paper ballots, and, had the Florida Supreme Court case stood up, Al Gore's the president. The U.S. Supreme Court overturns that, and Bush is the president. And a lot of Democrats denied those results and said that, the final tally on the election was 5-4, noting there were 5 justices that voted for Bush, 4 for Gore. So he didn't win, now we talk about who wins the swing states, how many electoral votes you need, and so forth. Then it was just 5-4. So there was denial then, and throughout that time, it seems now it's become almost an American pastime to deny the election. We've had it in gubernatorial races in Georgia, one of the states there, Stacey Abrams ran. And for a while, she was calling herself the governor. And it's like, you lost. And that was 2 years ago. Quit calling yourself governor. You're not the governor. You're not at the governor's mansion. You don't show up, in the General Assembly to talk to them. It's, you're not governor. Stop it. So I think in some ways we've become a country of election denial. And I don't think that's good for us either.
No, absolutely not. And just before we go, so quickly going back to Biden, one of his last acts as president was to pardon his son. And I guess most people in the same position would probably do the same thing. But do you think it was the final nail in the coffin of any moral authority of the left?
Yeah, that's a good point. I do. It's especially when, and our memories are so short, but when Trump was finishing his first term and we had January 6th and so forth, you had an awful lot of people on the left saying Trump is going to pardon his children. He's going to pardon himself.
Yeah.
And with his children, I thought, well, what did they do? They weren't even in the administration. What are you pardoning them for? And that doesn't even make sense. And I had never heard within any political circles that he even thought of doing that. But the left was saying it. And then, of course, Joe Biden does it for Hunter Biden and an awful lot of other people.
Yeah.
And it's like, how now can you go forward and argue? I think to your point, how do you have any moral authority to say, anybody Trump pardons? I think at this point it's like, well, they started it. It becomes you're at home with your siblings. You're like, Mom, he started it. He hit me first. So, and I think the Trump administration probably will use that argument, knowing that they had the lawfare, or what they consider the lawfare, and what I do. Happening last time. Why would you not pardon everybody in the administration just in case they might charge you with something? So I'm going to pardon you. I mean, that's become the playbook, and that's bad for the country, I think.
Yeah. Well, we're about to literally end. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dennis. It's been a huge pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you.